up for the meeting tonight, and we had some kind of a web contamination, and so we had to send out a new web link to the GoToMeeting. Hopefully, I know all of you on here got it. Hopefully, the others did. It looks like it's up to about 65 now. But we've got a great speaker, and I think you're going to enjoy the night. Before we go to the speaker, we're going to do a little chapter business like we do at all of our dinner meetings, and we'll walk through that fairly quickly and then get right into Alan Dunn. So the chapter, the Colorado chapter, we've gone completely virtual. We have board meetings via GoToMeeting. We have done about 40 hours of classes via GoToMeeting in 8-hour bites. And so they've been all-day classes, and I think they've worked out pretty well. This is our second dinner meeting. We did have our dinner meeting in March, and I know some of you came to that. And based on the information we had at the time, it seemed okay as long as we were distanced and had some sanitizer to have that March meeting. But shortly thereafter, it became where we couldn't have them. So our April meeting was virtual. It went pretty well. Your evaluations were appreciated, and they were pretty good. We did make a couple of adjustments based on some of the comments. So hopefully this one works out even better. We always have in the summer, we always have a strategic planning meeting. We run this chapter a lot like a business. And so we have a strategic planning session. We don't go out 5 or 10 years in our strategic plan. We typically go out 1 year because that's the term of our board of directors. And so we will have that sometime in early July. And as it's looking right now, it's going to be a virtual meeting, and probably 2. We're probably going to break it into 2 so it's not an entire evening, it's 2 short evenings. So if anyone would like to attend that virtually, please send me an email, and I will make sure you're on the invite and the agenda for when we get that set up to go to plan our next fiscal year. Our fiscal year does end at the end of June, and normally we don't have newsletters in the summer. Sometimes we do in August, but never in June and July. This year we're going to, so you can expect a newsletter coming out every month via the web. We also don't always have social networking or dinner meetings in the summer, and we're going to try to continue them through the summer, at least in some fashion. It might be a virtual cocktail hour, it might be a virtual tour, it might be just a networking meeting set up, it might be a dinner meeting like this set up, where you bring your own dinner, we bring the speaker. But we're going to try to stay connected with you all that way, and we'll just see how that goes as the summer goes on. So watch your emails. Another thing we do, someone said this is usually your big celebration. Our main meeting is always a celebration, and we celebrate a number of things. We celebrate the year that we had. We celebrate the year coming up. We swear in the new officers for the upcoming year, and we announce those officers at the March dinner meeting and approve that slate of officers, but we never did elect them, and we never did swear them in. And so what we're going to do is we're going to hold that to see what we do in the fall or at future meetings. And we as a board made a resolution that we would continue forward with that slate as though they were sworn in, but and it was the same slate as last year, actually. And so we'll do that at a later date. The other thing we always do at this celebration is we celebrate our member of the year, our company of the year, sometimes an instructor of the year, and we kind of like to make a big deal of that at the May dinner meeting. This year we're not going to do that. With all of the things we had changing in our chapter and everything happening, that is one thing that we decided that until we had everything settled down a little bit where we could think about it, we would not choose a company member or instructor of the year. So the good news is it gives you all a chance to send us any member of the board of directors you can send a note to and tell them who you think should be the member, company, or instructor of the year and why. And we'll look at that and come up with one and give the awards in due time. What I do want to do tonight, though, is I want to thank last year's board of directors. That is from July 1 of 2019 through June of 2020 this year. And that board of directors has a lot of people behind it. I'm just going to name off the elected members, but I really mean to thank everyone that is on that board of directors. We have a lot of programs, tours, classes, membership issues, websites, newsletters, company coordinator folks, everybody. It takes a lot to run this chapter, and with all the activities we have, so we would welcome all of those people to stand up right now if we were in the same room. But in the absence of that, I want to thank the board from last year, Honey Johnson, our Vice President of Education, Joe Grigg, our Vice President of Programs, Evan Beggs, the Vice President of Membership, Jamie Swan, our Secretary, Gary Williams, our Treasurer. And I want to thank you all very much, along with everybody that works on your teams, because I think it was a great year. We had some challenges the last couple of months, and our chapter has continued with everything that we normally do for the most part. And I appreciate that extra effort, but also the effort all through the rest of the year. So thank you all very much. With that, I want to turn it over to Honey Johnson to tell us about our education programs that are going on and what's coming up for the fall.
Thank you, Roger. Good evening, everyone. I'm so glad so many of you could make it with us tonight. That's wonderful. On the education front, we are about halfway through our CPIM Part 2 on the online learning, and we've got, as Roger said, we've gotten great reviews. We're finishing up DSP over the weekend, and we've got ECO coming up in June with SMAR following up in July. I'm very excited to announce that we've been able to put together an online CLTD course. We'll be sending out the information. The flyers will be coming out in the next few days, so watch for that. Registration will be open, and we'll look forward to getting some of you in the class. You know, we've had so many people that have a few people here and there that want to get into the class, and so we decided to open it up since we're online and see if we can broaden the scope of it. So I'm very excited to get that underway. The fall schedules for the education programs should be scheduled in August, so we know what's coming up. And so watch for news of the upcoming classes starting in the September timeframe, so we'll make those announcements in August. You know, one of the things that we're not able to do virtually that is something that I look forward to continuing once we start getting together again in person is being able to congratulate newly certified professionals with APICS certifications. So let me know when you are certified. I'm happy to make the announcement the next time we have an in-person dinner meeting. I'd love to be able to hopefully shake your hand, but absolutely present you with your certification pin and a crisp $100 bill for your achievement. So looking forward to continuing that in the fall. For those of you that have folks at your organizations that are looking for APICS certifications, we are happy to do private classes for you. Please contact me and we'll get together and see what we can do to get something staged for your folks. Always happy to get the APICS certifications in-house when we can for organizations. I'd like to just take a quick moment and thank Erin Cable for her help with the education team. She has been helpful in getting some of the odds and ends that I need help with taking care of for education. I absolutely want to thank our instructors for the Colorado chapter. You guys have been fantastic. So Roger Harris, Joe Grigg, Bob Abeda, I cannot thank you enough for the fantastic job you do in person and now online at delivering our courses. We would not be the same without your expertise and your dedication to APICS education. So a heartfelt thank you to all of you. That wraps it up for right now for me for education. Thank you so much and have a great evening.
Thank you, Honey. So next up would be membership, and Evan Beggs, but he had where he works, they make these desks that raise and lower, and for different heights if you want to stand up and stuff. And they have converted to some sort of medical equipment. And I can't remember for the life of me what it is, but they have converted to some kind of medical equipment that they're producing. And so he is working multiple shifts right now, helping manufacturing to get moving along on this new medical equipment, so he couldn't be here. So let's talk about membership for a minute. So we have about 310 members. That's down. This is a very heavy time for us for renewals of membership, this spring time frame for our chapter, just by luck of the draw. And what there has been with this crisis, we've had a lot of people not renew, and some people are furloughed, and so I'm sure that's adding to it. So we're down a little bit in membership, but I'm sure that it will be back. And along those lines, I just wanted to remind everybody again that APICS is great about extending your membership if you're unemployed. So if you're unemployed, there's a form to fill out. You can contact myself, or you can contact Evan Beggs, and we'll send you the form. I need to sign it for you. Need to fill it out. I sign it for you, and I send it in. That extends your membership for 6 months, and then we can do that 3 times. So we can extend a membership 18 months at no charge to you or the chapter. And so we'd love to do that. We don't want to lose people. So if you've been furloughed or your membership's coming up, we need to do it within 30 days of your membership expiring. So just get a hold of us and we'll do that. And it keeps you in the fold, keeps you connected with people, and I think it can, obviously the networking can help you to find your next employment opportunity. I think with that, that is everything that we have in our chapter business, other than something Joe might have. I'm going to turn this over to Joe Grigg, Vice President of Programs, so that he can talk about our speaker, and we'll get on with the program. Joe?
Thank you, Roger. Hey, it's great to be here. Great to have everybody gathering together. I do apologize for the internet glitch. Life is life, so we are still growing and people attending, so it's great to have them show up. It's such an honor to have Alan Dunn speaking tonight for us. Those of you that know me, how hard I try to make sure I find good speakers and with timely topics. Alan comes to us as a specialist in strategic planning, supply chain management, manufacturing, operations management, cost management, and business finance. He's president of GDI Consulting and Training Company and founder of Manufacturing Executive. This time for him to be able to come and talk to us about what this COVID-19 is doing to us and bringing us this topic of the triple bullwhip effect is such a rare opportunity, and I just have to so appreciate that he's able to come to us. Hopefully, Alan, you can turn. Let me give you speaker rights right now. Did you get it? Make a presenter. All right, Alan, you should be a presenter right now. You should be able to take over and start talking. Welcome, Alan. Your audio is still off, Alan. Yep.
There we go. Well, that should be fine. I presume everybody can hear me just fine. Let me get to
Very good, Alan.
There we go. It always takes just a second to get things set up. And there we go. So welcome, everybody. My name is Alan Dunn. I'm president, as he said, of GDI Consulting and Training Company. But more importantly, I sit on a number of boards of directors of sizable manufacturing companies, some of them private, some of them public. And so I've been keenly interested in the impact of this pandemic, the COVID pandemic, on companies. I happen to sit on the board of directors of probably the largest liquid asphalt company. It's a private company, the largest one in North America, a very large organization with 27 plants.
Excuse me for a second, Alan.
Yes.
If people want to see Alan's face as he's talking and see his picture, see him live, just scroll across your pictures there, because there's a lot of people on the webinar, and his is a live picture.
Yeah,
Thank you, Alan.
Okay, thank you. And so in that particular company, our concern is that a lot of cities and counties and municipalities, with all the COVID-19 aid and assistance that they're giving, that they're going to start cutting into their transportation budget. So interestingly enough, on that particular one, we're looking at a potential loss of demand. It isn't there yet, but it could be. I also sit on a publicly traded dietary supplement or nutrition supplement company. And our biggest problem there is getting human beings. We can't seem to get enough human beings to do the work for all the new business that we have. So you can see COVID-19 impacts different companies in different sorts of ways. So we're going to talk, in a sense, we're going to talk about big issues in this session. We're also going to talk about sales and operations planning issues as well. You almost can't separate the two. So at GDI, we always every year do a couple research projects. This year, we'd actually had done a fairly big research project on sales and operations planning and why its success is so elusive. And then COVID-19 broke out, and so we dug down into our economic staff and our people and started to really try to understand the impacts here. So when I take a look at the impacts of COVID-19, there's a lot. And so it makes me think about some urgencies that we need to all pay attention to. First off, and there's really three big urgencies we need to deal with in terms of supply chain professionals in the COVID-19 world. One is these are very unusual times, and I'm sorry, my friends, but the rule book has run out. There is no rule book, there are no rules, there are no lessons learned, there are no best practices that we can go and get off of a shelf and or go back into the recesses of our minds and pull out and decide what to do. We have to use an enormous amount of critical thinking skills to try to figure out what to do. And we know this is what's going to happen. We know that companies are either going to survive, in other words, they're going to weather this, get through it, or just barely survive. Some are going to die, and some are going to find a way to prosper. It is a truism that virtually every time there's a major economic crisis, someone comes out a winner. I have jokingly said many times in my life that hurricanes, if you live down in Florida, hurricanes are a terrible, terrible thing, unless you're the roofer in town. Then the hurricane creates and drives business for you. So there's going to be some new business that's going to come out of this. We're just going to have to figure out what it is and how to get into those lines of business. The third reason that this topic is important is that in some way, manufacturing companies will recover. It's kind of a big chess game in life right now. So we don't really know how they're going to recover, and we don't really know where they're going to recover and what they're even going to do out of that. But I want to walk you through some of the reasons, the logic and the rationale behind our studies and the folks that we've talked with. So let's talk about what's really happened in your world. And this slide is so important, because it is not all about COVID-19. I can tell you that everything in the news is about COVID-19. You know that. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. But the reality is it's not about COVID-19 entirely. If we go back to September of last year, we started to see an oil problem. We started to see a big global oil issue. And that was largely between Russia and Saudi Arabia. Now, sitting on the board of directors of a large liquid asphalt company where what's left over after refining is called asphalt liquor, and that's our raw products. And we literally buy billions of gallons of this a year. We have I don't even know how many tanks, but we have billions of gallons of storage that we're buying of that. It's called the residual or the resid product from oil refiners. And we started noticing all the way back in September, we started seeing oil prices coming down, and we couldn't understand why. And it turns out Saudi Arabia is trying to drive all the inefficient producers out of the marketplace. They succeeded with Venezuela, and they're working on Russia and some others. And so they've created such a glut of oil that there's actually oil tankers off the shore of California and off the shore of Texas that probably have 40 million barrels of oil, and there is nowhere to put it. And so that's driving oil prices down, damaging the Russian economy and a lot of other economies as well. And so, and by the way, this is important to understand that oil is largely used on the ocean. It's oftentimes used as a hedging strategy by currency traders. And so it's really interesting when a ship leaves Saudi Arabia to go to the Gulf, to Louisiana or Texas. It's not unusual for the ownership of the cargo to change hands a couple hundred times. Well, we've actually seen since the beginning of the year, we've seen literally cargo ships that have the ownerships traded hands in the thousands of times during its voyage. So there's an enormous amount of chaos in an energy-centric world that's connected to the financial world. Well, what that did is that led to some investment problems. And so we started to see in December, actually late November, early December, we started seeing margin calls. If you think about it, we've had one of the best economies in the last 3 years that we've had in a long time. And so enormous amounts of investors were borrowing money with low rates. They could borrow money at 3-4%. They were making 10, 12, 15% in the market. And who wouldn't borrow money to make that kind of money in the market? Well, all of a sudden, you start getting a shock in the market as a result of global oil and some other issues, but mostly global oil. And the next thing you know, the prices of stocks start going down, and the collateral on these loans starts to go down, and the investment organizations, the banks, start calling in their collateral, or what we call margin calls. And so we saw the huge sell-offs, and that was really driven largely by margin calls. Probably could have gotten through this. We've been through this one before. That probably would have led, particularly with the loose lending going on these days, or at least up until a few weeks ago, we probably could have gotten through that with less pain than it took to get through the 2008 financial crisis. But then came along COVID-19. And COVID-19 effectively shut down global commerce. There has never been a time in history, at least not the history that we can find, where global commerce has been shut down on purpose. Trading has been shut down in commodities, products aren't shipping, retailers aren't open, restaurants aren't open, manufacturers are shut down or not working. In some states, people are precluded or prohibited from going to work for a variety of reasons. And so we've shut down global commerce in a world that already has an energy crisis, not an energy shortage, but an energy surplus crisis, and a world where the financial institutions are having these huge margin calls. And so this has just created a nightmare. But it's not any one of those individually. It's the convergence of all three of those at the same time. Now, why do I go through this with you? I go through this because I want you to understand that whatever solutions you put in place in your supply and demand planning operations, it's not going to just be around suppliers, production, operations, the ability to manufacture, and demand. There's also going to be some issues in the economy where there's going to be less liquidity. So this is a great slide. I went to the World Bank, and I looked at the World Bank, and I asked them for some data, and here's what I got back. In 2008, an internal report by the World Bank, this is end of 2008, by the way, so it was the end of the first year of the financial crisis. They estimated an impact of a mild flu pandemic at about 0.7% of global GDP, and a moderate at about 2%, and a severe at about 4.8%. That would be the difference between a slowdown, a downturn, and a global recession as deep as the one we saw in 2008. So a severe outbreak would effectively be the equivalent of a global recession. Well, if I go back, I don't actually have the most current data, but I do have data from May 2nd, with the global GDP on May 2nd. So what, 14, 15 days ago, or no, 10 days ago, was down 2.9%. That comes to about $3 trillion. The global economy has been reduced by about $3 trillion. And here's what this does, and here's why this is not all just about the pandemic. The pandemic has impacted the workforce and impacted the company's ability to sell. That's impacted the economy overall, and that's put more fright and tended to reduce demand. When all of those happen, liquidity becomes a huge issue. And so your companies, every manufacturing company out there, unless they have just a god-awful large balance sheet of assets, of liquid assets, cash and securities, they have to pay attention to this. Goldman Sachs today says that we're now above the unemployment of the peak of the Great Depression in 1933. 1933, the peak of the Great Depression, unemployment was 24.9%. So if you take the 3.5% unemployed people that we had, about 5.5 million people unemployed prior to COVID-19, and you add to that the 34 million that have filed unemployment claims in the last 5 weeks, that takes you up to around 26.5. Compare it to the number of working individuals of about 147 million, that takes you to about 26%. So Goldman Sachs is probably correct in their assessment of what real unemployment is. It doesn't mean, it doesn't equate to the typical unemployment number, because that also excludes people who aren't looking for work. So it would exclude those 3.5% that are 5.5 million that actually aren't working. So here's our problem. When companies come out of this recession, or come out of this pandemic recession, that doesn't mean that demand's going to come back right away. It could take years for some of that demand to come back. And so we need to be planning for a world that's, in a sense, demand starved. There'll be some companies, just like roofers in a hurricane, there'll be some companies that will do really well, but there's going to be some companies that are going to do terrible, such as being in the business of supporting the airline industry, supporting the production of airplanes, or building airplanes. This is a really, really tough one. Think about the seat manufacturers. We're probably going to need a third less seats if the health officials get their way. So there's a lot of impacts that are going to drive demand, probably, well, certainly not up, but probably down across the board. So this kind of leads us to what we call a moment of wisdom. We tend to put these moments of wisdom in our programs. And the first moment of wisdom is this: it is important to be realistic about the potential duration, not of the virus itself, but of the duration of the extraordinary new business cycle that you are all now thrust into. Let's make sure that's clear. We are all thrust into a new business cycle. This isn't people get sick, people get better, country starts back up. That's not going to happen. There's no signs of that. There's no evidence that can or will happen. This is not a time for priorities to be driven by strategy and hope. And this is a bit provocative, I'm going to tell you. This is not the time to be worrying about long-term strategies. Responsible supply chain leaders, while remaining optimistic, because we have to assume a worst-case economic cycle. It's time to get real. I spent an enormous amount of time reviewing and working with investment banking firms and private equity companies to try to figure out where their companies are going, particularly in this new pandemic era. And the problem is the data is all over the place, and even some of the data we don't believe. And so we have a real problem in terms of what are we going to do and how are we going to get there. So we dig back to John Maynard Keynes, said the long run is a misleading guide to current affairs. In the long run, we're all dead. And so what he's really saying there, in a funny sort of way, he's saying that there's really no long term without a series of successful short-term successes. And our first success, our priority right now, of course, is to survive. So how has that changed us in the supply chain world? Well, everybody who's listening, it looks like we have about 70 plus people on now. All 70 of you probably are excellent at planning and execution. Oh my goodness, I've been involved with APICS since the middle 70s, probably like Roger and some of the others that did such a nice job of introducing me today. We've been involved for a long time, and we know how good everybody is at planning and execution. People in APICS have changed the world. Economists have told me that 25 years ago, looking at inventories, industrial inventories, gave us a sense of the direction of the economies. If we saw inventories creeping up, that meant the economy was going down. But they can't use inventories anymore because we tend, as professionals in supply chain, we tend to wind inventory down along with economies and wind it up with economies. And so we know we've changed the world when we've changed the way economists look at the world. So we're excellent at planning and execution. We got to set all that aside for a little bit here, my friends. And we need to be thinking about priorities. And I'm going to share with you in a little bit, I'm going to share with you 8 priorities. I'm going to talk about the priority in human safety. You know, I teach programs at the California Institute of Technology. We have, I think, the finest next generation global supply chain leadership program. It's a 18-month program in e-learning format. In live format, it's a 22-month, and we go all over the world with the best and brightest young talent that are provided to us by multinational companies. And in all of our manufacturing and operations courses, we always start with the number one expectation of a manufacturing company is that everybody goes home the way they came to work. In other words, safety is number one. We jokingly talk about when you recruit plant managers, one of the questions you always have to ask a plant manager is, tell me what the number one issue is you have on your mind every day as a plant manager. And if that plant manager in the interview doesn't start by talking about safety, if they start with talking about productivity and efficiency, that's not the plant manager for you. So human safety is important. We're going to talk about that in response to COVID-19. Second is a realistic assessment of risks. It's time that everybody by this time next week does a realistic assessment of your business risks, no holds barred. And if you've already done that, good for you. If you haven't, we need to get on that. The third priority is to preserve capital. And I'm going to talk about that with some very specific requirements or suggestions. Fourth is to try to ensure continuity of supply and demand. And both of those are going to be problematic. Supply is probably going to be more problematic than demand, particularly if you have supply now coming from the big bad monster, which is how it's being portrayed, of China. And so China is a big issue to a lot of us. I talked to some TSA and some customs individuals yesterday. They're stopping certain products at the border now and inspecting them more than they used to. And so everything customs does now is around COVID-19. The fifth priority we're going to talk about is destruction of business models and how whole business models are going to be destroyed. I, this time last year, went to MIT because I'm a real student of distant learning and different ways to teach people in programs like this. And I've been studying this for a lot of years. And so I went to MIT and I got to go through a tour of their dynamic holographic imaging facility, which is I sit on one side of the table, you sit down the hallway at a very similar table on the other side, except I'm talking to you and your hologram is sitting live, real-time hologram is sitting on the other side of the table. And every little nuance of you I can see. And I looked at that, and when I demonstrated that, by the way, took a supercomputer to run it, and it had about 13 seconds worth of bandwidth. So we have a long way to go to make that realistic. But it did give me a glimpse into the real competitor of the airlines in the future. It may not be airline versus airline. It may be airline versus dynamic holographic imaging or some other similar technology. So there's going to be whole destruction of business models. We're also going to have to take a look at regulatory compliance risks. Every manufacturing company and every supply chain partner has a number of risks. And we're going to talk about this. I'm not going to jump too far into it right now because it's a very provocative subject. I'll just give you a hint, and then I'm going to make a suggestion that we don't actually have to comply with every requirement that's handed by a government or a municipality or some regulatory agency. It's a provocative comment. I'll talk to you more about that in a minute. There's going to be, now we get to past the negatives, and now we get to the positives. There's going to be some emergence of some new business models, and there's going to be enterprise transformation in your organization. Look, I am absolutely blown away by the number of companies right now, because I get calls all the time, that are looking for board members with supply chain experience. You know, we see senators and congressmen and regulators and the president of the United States using the phrase supply chain. We've never seen that before. And now companies are looking for individuals with global supply chain experience to put in their governance roles, to put on their boards of directors. So it's not just a supply problem, it's seriously a demand, and it may be far more than that. So let's talk about human safety. Let's just get into human safety. So we obviously need a fully engaged HES organization, but we also need a fully engaged IT organization. Let me tell you what I mean by that. HES needs to be engaged for obvious reasons. The health, environmental, and safety group needs to be involved because we need to deal with the social distancing at work, the masking requirements and those sort of things. We need to deal with, I have clients, you get your temperature, somebody takes the temperature of your head as you walk in the door. And if it's high, you turn around and go home. So HES tends to be fairly involved, but IT is the one that we've observed that has not been as involved as they can. Witness the fact that the amount of people that are working at home that are having enormous problems with meetings and remote communication. I've talked to a dozen IT professionals who just can't keep up with it because there's bandwidth problems, there's reliability problems, there's lowest common denominator connection problems, there's all kinds of issues. And even more interesting than that is the fact that now people aren't working around their bosses, at least people that have office-bound jobs are not working around their bosses. Bosses have no idea how to manage people they don't see. And this is creating enormous amounts of stress. And so we have to find a way to get IT more engaged. Let me tell you, if your HES department and your IT department are not pulling double shifts right now, then they're not paying attention. So we obviously are going to see changes in work locations where people can work at home. Because I'm a consultant, I tend to live on the road, not in the last 8 weeks, but I tend to live on the road. And so, Starbucks and places like that are kind of mobile offices in a way, but that doesn't work anymore. So this is becoming a big issue for a lot of people. Work methods are becoming important because now we have to change how people interact and how they work. That's why video calls are better than audio calls, because you can see the person's lips and that way you don't interrupt them as much. And this is the one big benefit that we've seen with the Zoom calls and the GoToMeeting calls, is that people actually are listening a little bit more. So there has to obviously be more attention to workplace hygiene, which we've talked about in social distancing. And we have to get bosses to walk away from what we call the presentism syndrome. Presentism means that if people aren't present, they must not be working. So there's an organization in San Jose, nonprofit called Smart Valley LLC. Smart Valley org. They did a study a number of years ago and looked at 47,000 remote workers and discovered the opposite of what you think. They discovered, and this has been proven, by the way, several additional studies, that individuals that remote work oftentimes are more stressed than ones who come to the office every day. One is they come to the office and it's that social atmosphere, and that actually helps to reduce stress. But the other is it's too easy to work. So it turns out the average remote worker is working more hours in a day than they would at work. And they rationalize it in all kinds of weird ways, like I didn't have to drive and things like that. And so as it turns out that they're working more, so that's causing more stress. And also, again, bosses don't know how to manage them, because when you work remotely, you can only be measured on achievement because you can't even see the effort. And so this is becoming a big issue and has to be addressed. Leadership styles in this remote working environment, or leadership styles even in the social distancing factory environments, we have to have good leadership. If ever we need a good leadership, now is the time, and that has to be firm but fair. So I want you to remember this: companies compete for talent as much as they compete for customers. We have to take care of our employees. I've seen wholesale workforces walk out and leave in the last 8 weeks. I know of a company that has a wage rate where the individuals staying home with the unemployment and the extra $600 kicker from the federal government are making more than they are if they go to work. And so the companies are struggling with, how do we solve this? Do we pay them the same amount? Do we pay them 5% more, 10% more? Do we offer them bonuses? What do we have to do? And so this has become, I don't have a solution for that, by the way, that will work for everybody. We've had a problem with one of the companies I sit on the board, and we dealt with it and addressed it, but probably in a different way than other companies would. So let's talk about the second of the 8. That's realistic assessment of risks. Every one of you is a supply chain professional. If you have any certifications, and particularly those with PMPs, with project management certifications, or any sort of engineering certification, and all of you industrial engineers and manufacturing engineers, you know how to do these kinds of risk assessments. So you know how to do an assessment of what's the probability of losing talent and how that talent can impact you. You also, if you've done supplier assessments, you know how to go out and look at the internal supplier versus the external supplier. You know how to do that. So we have to go and do some assessments. I'm going to talk a little bit more about supplier in a second here. But it has to be a formal structure of looking at assessments. And every one of you has a tool called Failure Modes Effects Analysis, or FMEA. It's not the only tool for doing risk assessment, but it's one that supply chain professionals know, and it's one that works and will work in almost any environment. So we have to take a look at what's the risk of losing customers, of losing channels, and losing distribution rights, and those sort of things. We also have to look at the risk of capital, which I'm going to talk about in the next one, the next session item. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're also going to talk about compliance risks, so I won't go over them here. So here's kind of the action plan. Immediately, tomorrow, start performing a comprehensive risk assessment using the FMEA models that you learned in your Six Sigma and in your Lean workshops. And each one of those, you should be able to get a picture of the demand risks, the supply risks, the compliance risks, the talent risks, and the capital risks. So let's get on to that capital risk. Now, this is Alan Dunn, the board member, now talking. It's all about liquidity, liquidity, liquidity. If we learned anything in 2008, when the credit markets froze and companies couldn't even draw their available lines of credit, we've learned that in times of crisis, there's almost never a shortage of a commodity. There's just a how much you're willing to pay for it problem. There's a shortage of capital more than a shortage of commodity. So we need to ensure what we call our leverage capacity. So what that means, and I've advised all of my clients to do this, because we believe there will be a credit freeze. We believe that the banks, by the way, believe there will be a credit freeze. There already is a credit freeze in certain markets. Almost all the big lenders have stopped jumbo mortgage loans now. There's almost no way to get a jumbo mortgage loan in the United States unless you have a spectacular relationship with a bank. Sure, there's a few being written, but not many. And in California, where you can't buy a house without a jumbo loan, that pretty much means that the California housing market in New York and places like that are going to just dry up if they aren't already. So we've recommended to all of our clients, and every board I sit on, we've looked at how much is open on our line of credit, and we went and borrowed it up, and we put it in the bank. You know, generally, when you balance it all off, it might cost you 1% or 2% of interest, but it's worth it. It's worth it. So do that. And then also, if you have any covenants that you're going to break with your current bank, get ahead of them. Don't let the bank discover them. Don't surprise them. Get ahead of them and start telling them that now, because you don't need to have a bank surprised. Reprioritize all non-essential CapEx projects, all of them. Go through every CapEx project. Safety obviously gets done, at least the important ones get done, and other things you're going to have to put off. That's just the way it goes. Push hard on collections. Don't be afraid to make a deal, even given a 3% cash discount if they'll pay immediately. Make whatever deals you have to do to get your money faster. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. We know there's going to be a supply chain mismatch. We know there's going to be a bullwhip on the supply chain or on the supplier side. Well, there's going to be one on the demand side too. More about that later. But we know there's going to be a major bullwhip on the supply side. And there's going to be lots of companies competing for supplies. We could see some commodities under allocations very quickly here as we start to turn the economy around. And so we want you not to beat your suppliers up. We want you to protect their liquidity. Go through and assess your suppliers and make sure that the ones that you can't live without, that you really take care of them. And the asphalt company, we actually are paying faster than we've ever paid to protect certain sources of supply. And so it's a counterintuitive thought, but you're going to need those important suppliers. Again, file for every government action you can get. I told my kids this: if you're unemployed, get on. Don't be bashful. Go get your unemployment. If you're a company, get your PPP. You probably can't get it now, but a lot of my clients applied for PPP, and a number of them, not all of them, but a number of them got it. Renew your budget. In other words, cut the budget. Almost all my clients, the ones that are not growing as a result of being in the right place at the right time, are seeing 20, 30 or more % budget cuts. So your action item here is to assign a team in your company to assess every source of available capital and assign a capital preservation set of responsibilities. I'm responsible for expense reduction. You're responsible for bank relationships. You're responsible for collections. You're responsible, and that's a team that every day talks and meets. Don't think of this as business as normal. The AP people and the AR people and the general accounting people will do. No, get them together in a room and tell them their life depends upon managing that capital at this point in time. And part of that is to cut expenses. So the best way to cut expenses, if you look at the right side of the screen, if you squint and blow it up a little bit, you can see it better, is to really start thinking about non-value added activities, value added, non-value added, non-value added required. Go and get your second or third year industrial engineering students. They'll understand this. Go and find somebody who knows something about activity-based cost accounting. They'll know how to do this. And they'll know how to go through department by department, function by function, process by process, and identify the value-added elements of that process, the non-value-added elements, and what we call the non-value-added required. Non-value-added required are things you have to do because it's better to do them than not to do them. So for example, reworking something in a downstream station that somebody messed up in an upstream station, you do that to save money. So that would be a non-value-added required sort of activity. And do it for every plant, every product, every function, and every activity. Segment it based on, as I said, value-added, non-value-added, and non-value-added required. And then once that's done, start attacking the non-value-added, because non-value-added is typically work area centric. Non-value-added required is typically systemic. And so you're going to have, so non-value-added is going to be easier to get at. Now on the top of this screen, you see that formula called operating cash flows over total gross assets minus total current liabilities. What this really is cash flow over assets, gross, not net. So this is, you add depreciation back. This is a poor man's view of cash flow return on investment. We, back in the 90s, or actually 90s, and then we redid it in 2005, we took all Fortune 500 companies that have been in the Fortune 500 for 20 years. And we looked at those and we went back quarter minus 80, in other words, 20 years, and we got rid of all the funny accounting. So we depreciated things correctly. We went back and we accounted for leases. A lease is just a different way of acquiring a use of an asset. So we'd pull a lease, an operating lease on the balance sheet. Basically what we turned is we went back to quarter minus 80 and we created an economic balance sheet, an economic P&L. We were able to capture and to calculate the economic retained earnings, which then folded into quarter minus 79. And we did it again and did it again all the way up to quarter minus 1, the last quarter. So we looked 20 years back, 80 quarters. And then we did that for every single company that had been on the Fortune 500 for 20 years. And it was 383 of them. So everything I talked about, we did 383 times. And we discovered once we did that and we could calculate the cash throw off from the gross assets, call it CFROI, cash flow return on investment, we discovered for the manufacturing sector, the stock price that the public companies were achieving in the marketplace laid right on top of that line. So in other words, the marketplace recognized that kind of behavior. It's a valuation behavior. It's asking the question, how do I know what I do is going to increase the value of the company, not how do I know what am I going to do is going to increase the profits of the company. And so it's a different way of looking at it. And so if you were just to ask yourself, every activity, what does that do to increase cash flow or decrease it? And how many assets are in play to make that happen? Then you would have the right mindset to understand valuation. And by the way, if anybody wants more information on this, please give me a call. We can walk you through the logic and give you the world's driest textbook, but one of the most valuable textbooks you'll ever read on this subject. It's called The Value Imperative by James McTaggart out of Wharton School. So now let's talk about demand and supply. We moved past that leverage, and now we're going to talk about demand and supply. So I want you to obviously assess your customer's ability to pay, and I want you to maybe get rid of some customers that are too big of a risk. We may have to shallow out the customer base a little bit. We may not be able to be everything to everybody in this economy. We may have to slow down or cut back in order to grow. But I do want you to regularly communicate with your customers. I don't want you to stop communicating with them. Then I want you to go and I want you to assess your supplier's performance and risks. So this is something that's really important. I want you to use this tool you see to the left. This is a risk assessment matrix. It's used to isolate critical suppliers and critical components. And you're going to conduct this risk assessment by looking at least 4 major variables. And then from that, you'll be able to either increase safety stocks or find alternate sources of supply or get your suppliers to put stuff on this side of the ocean. And you're going to immediately use this to qualify new suppliers. So let's kind of shift over and let's take a look at the left side of this screen. So on the left axis, this is a 2x2 matrix. On the left axis, you see that is labeled length of lead time. And the top of that is high and the bottom of it is low. Let me get my pen going here. So you can see this axis over here, the top of it is high, the bottom of it is low. And so the length of lead time is one of the 4 major determinants of risk. And so then we look at the bottom and we have the supplier's yield and quality variations, which means you need to get their CPK data. You need to get their internal quality data. Like you can't just say, well, they ship me everything and it's good. But if they're throwing half of it away or scrapping half of it and sorting the good ones for you, then that means they're wasting an enormous amount of their capacity, and that gets risky for you. So we call those 2 variables, the length of lead time and the yield, supplier's yield and quality variations, we call those the supplier controlled variables. Okay? And over on the other side, we have, and we're looking at a part number for when we do this. And we look at that same part number and we ask, how many alternate suppliers are there? Obviously, if you have a lot of alternate suppliers, it's less risky than if you have few. Just as if the lead time is short, it's less risky than if the lead time is long. And if the supplier has less quality and yield variations, then that's less risky than one that has enormous yield and quality variations. The 4th element on this matrix is what we call environmental impact. It's not only environment like environment. I mean the environment or the ecosystem around that supplier. So for those of you who've ever been to St. Catharines, Ontario, north of Buffalo, across the border up in Canada, you'll know that in the wintertime, it's hard to get trucks in and out of there. And so if it's hard to get trucks in and out, that means there's a reliability problem. If you have suppliers in Venezuela, good luck. And so the environmental impactants are the things that around the ecosystem around that supplier, and those are rated from low or few to many. And so if you take a look at this point right here, I have a particular part number in a particular plant for a particular supplier, and I've assessed that the lead times are long and the yield and quality variations are slightly better than average, perhaps. And so that converges up to that point right up there, which is in this kind of manageable risk category. And then I go and I look at the external variables, and I determine very quickly that there's very few alternate suppliers, and there's lots of impactants. And so I get the convergence there. And then what I do is I just do something statistically unsound, but illustratively important. I connect those 2 dots, and you can see most of the points are inside the high risk category. Most of the area between those 2 points is in that high risk. What does that mean? Well, it means any part number from any supplier that's in that area, you get out and do a formal performance and risk assessment. If it's down here, don't worry about it. You can buy your way out on those problems. That's where safety stock is a good thing because it helps you at a fairly inexpensive and easy rate. The other ones are a little bit problematic, but those 2 quadrants, we call it quadrant 1, 2, and 3, and 4. So quadrant 3 is the biggest challenge that you have. So we want you to go and do a formal performance risk assessment. Now, we actually have a business unit in our company, and this is what we do. We're not doing any now because we're not allowed to travel. However, we've done these all over the world. We've done about 170 of them where companies contact us to go out to assess their suppliers. Our methodology looks at 19 areas of performance and risk, although most clients just do the ones in yellow. And so we look at their economic viability of their supplier. We look at their production processes, their maintenance, their methods, their equipment, their facility, how they manage inventory, their leadership, their catastrophe plan. We look at all of that. And we rank every one of those 19, or in most cases 12 elements. We rate it using the scale at the bottom, and then we have a composite scale. And then we get into a sense. And by the way, every one of them, we use that 2x2 matrix I just showed you. And we get a sense of how risky that is. Look, this is just a diagnostic routine. You can do it yourself. You know, we love to get engaged to do this, but we teach companies all the time how to do this. And so it's a supplier assessment on steroids is what it is. But that's what's needed now, because we don't have time to get caught with a bad supplier in this kind of a supply chain world. Now, this is the time to talk about what we call the TSB, or the triple simultaneous bullwhip. So we have a simultaneous bullwhip headed our way. You're going to experience a bullwhip in demand, a bullwhip in supply, and a bullwhip in transportation. I'll explain that one in just a second. This, we think, operationally is going to be the difference between survival and non-survival of a manufacturing company. We think the ability to get honest about the demand and understanding the demand's going to come at you in waves. It's going to oscillate at you, and you're going to have to figure out how to build ahead and at what level. You're not going to oftentimes be able to build fully configured products. And so you're going to have to, and then you're going to have to figure out how to say no to some companies, because a demand bullwhip itself will feed a supply bullwhip. You've got a supply bullwhip being fed by suppliers that now are trying to ramp up with a lot of customers, not just you. And so, and then you have the logistics and the transportation bullwhip, where, and you'll see in a minute, where we're trying to get all the equipment deployed into the right spots or the right places. I'll talk more about that in a little bit, in a minute. So we have some destruction of business models. That means you have to rationalize customers and suppliers. You're going to have to get rid of some customers. The customer that's slowing you down, that's a small bit customer. Now, by the way, the sales department will always tell you that that's a strategic customer, and if we get rid of them, other customers will follow. They'll fabricate every reason in the world. But the reality is, you've got to look at the numbers, and you've got to make some tough decisions. You may have to rationalize your business model. Every restaurant's rationalized their business model. The ones that are going to open up are the ones that did a really good job of curbside service and kept their cash flow positive. The ones that are not going to open up are the ones that just that have no ability to support that, don't even have the money to fill up the refrigerators and freezers with the food for when they open up. So you should expect remote work to increase. This is part of the business model. Employees are going to ask, why do I have to come to work? This worked out just fine. If that's the case, then dispose some assets. Get rid of some offices if you have to. The fundamentals of work are going to be redefined, and I don't even know how. All I know is that you can't take people for 90 days and tell them not to come to the office, or not to come to the planning department, or not to come, and then tell them all of a sudden now they got to go back. There's going to be some changes in work design, and there's going to be some changes where supply comes from, because there's going to be a sovereignty in the supply chain. Nick Testa, another past chairman of APICS, and myself are working on a research project in a paper that talks about sovereign supply chains. And what a sovereign supply chain is a free market supply chain where the government says there are some products that cannot be at least fully produced and fully imported or fully offshored outside the United States. And so for those of you in the international sales world, or even in the domestic sales world, you're going to start to find, we're pretty sure there's going to be some constraints imposed on you. Like we've jokingly said, for the American population, I don't actually care where the Pringles potato chips are made, but I don't think I want China making triggers for nuclear missiles. Now that's a bit of an exaggeration of it for an example, but it gets the point across that we have to find those items, and someone is going to start to look at those items. We saw what happened when we couldn't get face masks, when we couldn't get scrubs. We couldn't get things, ventilators and things like that. So some of that was probably numbers that people didn't know what they were talking about, but there was some genuine shortages as a result of international or global supply chain breakdowns. So we're going to have to rethink that. That's going to be a big issue for supply chain people. It's going to be more than just country of origin restrictions. It's going to be balancing without cutting off. By the way, I don't think anybody who's talking about sovereign supply chains wants to cut off imports. We want to encourage innovation around the globe because it helps it lifts all ships. But we don't want to create problems for the domestic population. Terms and conditions are probably going to be as important. In fact, I'm hearing this all the time now, that I'll cut my price if you'll pay me faster. And so T's and C's are going to be the big negotiating tool of this year and probably through 2021. Vertical integration and partnerships we're going to have to rethink for a variety of reasons, including owning a source of supply that might be what we call a sovereign source of supply. I can guarantee you travel is going to change. The travel industry, we were talking to some economists hired by United Airlines 2 weeks ago, and they generally think it'll be 3 years of reduced travel. Business travel is going to be the biggest hit, and we've already seen that. I actually flew 2 weeks ago. I had an emergency flight I had to take for a client issue, and I remember it was LA to Dallas, and it was $57 round trip, and there were 7 of us on the airplane. And so things are going to change for sure. And even at $57, they couldn't fill the plane up. So here's your action. Rationalize and prioritize your customers and your products and focus only on those that can help your company through these difficult times. You're going to have to make some tough decisions. We're going to have to walk away from some customers. Now let's get to the provocative element, number 6, and that's managing regulatory compliance. Okay, here's what you need to do. Another task team in your company. You put them together, evaluate every compliance requirement, break it down into safety compliance, legal compliance, environmental compliance, SEC compliance, OSHA compliance, break it down the natural ways that anybody would look at compliance. And go through and identify every piece of compliance requirement that you have. And then identify on each of those what is the impact of non-compliance. There's going to be a surprising number to all of you of how many compliance activities you do where there's very little or no impact, no consequence of non-compliance. And so I want you to know that, because then what I want you to do is identify the compliance requirements that you're going to adjust during this period of uncertainty, that we're not walking away. We're just saying we are going to adjust them. I'll give you a classic example. Every big HR department gets almost a request a day in big companies for surveys, to participate in a survey. And a lot of those are government organizations, and they send out these very scary letters. You need to provide this information. We need it by June 15th. And you look, and if you read everything, there's no or else. And you pick up the phone and you call them and go, well, what if I don't, do this? And they'll tell you you're a bad citizen. But the reality is, you're going to fill this thing out. You're probably not going to get a report or anything back. So what's the value? Well, stop doing it. Just stop doing it, because your valuable time is more important than the information you're not going to get back on those kind of surveys. Now, obviously, I'm not advocating that you stop complying. I'm just advocating that you look at the realistic compliance requirements in a kind of an apocalyptic world. I mean, I'm not trying to scare anybody, but when we've got unemployment numbers as big as the Great Depression, when we have 39 million people not able to work, well, not willing or able to work, and no sign that it's going to get better anytime soon, we have got to prepare for some problems in our marketplaces. So I don't want you to waste a lot of time on unnecessary compliance, feel-good compliance. So I want you then to build an updated compliance plan that reflects the reality. And to do that, by the way, you're going to go back to your FMEA stuff again, and you're going to look at what's the occurrence probability, what's the occurrence severity, and what's the occurrence consequences. So years ago, I worked with a big property and casualty insurance company, one of the few non-manufacturing consulting jobs I ever did. And we looked at how they insure. So they insure in those days Kmart stores, and they had a huge probability of slip and fall accidents and all kinds of stuff, but the severity was small on any of them. So interestingly enough, because of the daily number of claims, the thousands, tens of thousands of claims a year for little non-severe things, but an enormous amount of administrative and legal overhead, they had to price the rates fairly high. Then you go to a place like, in those days, San Onofre nuclear power plant, where the probability of an occurrence of a major problem was very, very low. I mean, less than a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of 1%, because of all the fail-safe mechanisms they put in place that were constantly reviewed and approved by government and non-government agencies. And then, but the severity was really high, but the severity likely would never happen. So interestingly enough, to cover a city's worth of Kmarts was more expensive to insure than a nuclear power plant. And that was because of the difference between probability and severity. And then you look at the consequences and the occurrence of those consequences. And it's not just the economics, it's also the political, the social, the community, etc. So what your action item is have some of your task team members take on the task of looking at all the compliance issues. What we're trying to do is get rid of non-value added work. That's what we're trying to do. 7, I talked about new business models. They all start with a view towards customers. Look at this employees remotely working as positive. Look at how to mix gig workers, that is 1099 type workers, in your teams better than you've done before. That turns a fixed cost into a variable cost, by the way. Look at onshoring. There's a lot of stuff, opportunities coming back, and logistics are going to be your big challenge. Talk about that one in a second. So start thinking about business opportunities for logistics, like putting factories next to customers, things like that. Look at how you're using your distribution channels, what we call channel intermediaries. Do you really need to go from your factory to a distributor off to a customer for truckload shipments? Why can't you just go direct? So this would be a time to look at all elements of your omni-channel and all elements of your outbound and inbound. And then the other one is, we feel very strongly about this. Whoever does demand planning and forecasting needs to be supplemented by someone with some strong, and I mean really strong, macroeconomics to understand what's going on in the world. Because interestingly enough, COVID-19 wasn't unpredictable. Maybe it might have been in June of last year, but it wasn't in November. There were clear signs in November. There were clear signs of oil issues in August, September. There were clear signs of margin problems in the middle of the fourth quarter. And so all this has impacted and would have caused you to start reducing budgets in December. Now you have a tool for doing a lot of this called the voice of the customer analysis. Every one of you who's gone through lean manufacturing training, every one of you who's gone through Six Sigma training, every one of you who's gone through total quality management training, every one of you who studied at APICS has gone through a voice of the customer analysis somewhere in your career, or at least you've seen it or you've read it. So that's the tool, that's the instrument you need. And let's go and talk about 8. 8 is just kind of, your companies are going to transform, but it's not going to just transform technically. It's going to be organizationally, culturally, and behaviorally. Let's talk about what those are. Technically, you're going to take a look at your systems and your tools and your policies and procedures and get rid of the non-value added stuff. Organizationally, you're going to probably change where and how people work. Culturally, you're going to have to figure out how to manage human beings that you don't see every day. You're going to have to learn how to manage and lead by achievement and not by achievement and feel. And then behaviorally, people themselves are going to have to adapt to this. Interestingly enough, when companies go through transformation, we always ask, what of those 4 elements is the easiest to overcome? And it's technical, because it's just about money and time and maybe some broad thinking. If I ask the question, what category of impediments do most transformations mostly focus on? If you said technical, you'd be right. And that's why most transformations fail. If you ask the question, what categories of impediments in a transformation really drive the success? And if you said organization, cultural, and perhaps behavioral, you'd be absolutely right. So we have to pay attention to those. Those are not soft subjects. Those are human subjects. So I want you to build a transformation possibilities board or a tool where you can get people together and encourage them in teams to start thinking about how to rewrite the code, the fundamental code, the fabric of the code of your business. My moment of wisdom on this is that enterprise transformation can only be achieved with successfully addressing all four elements in that model. Now, let's talk about when you restart your supply chains so I can wrap this up and get you home. Well, I guess you are at home. Here's something you need. We did a big study on this. We updated it just last night, and it's still the same. Ocean ships for global trade are mostly in the wrong places. So if you needed to ship something from China right now or from the Gulf, or the Arab Gulf right now, there probably wouldn't be a ship there to do it, to load. Most of the ships in the world, ocean ships, are in the wrong spot. They're in the wrong place, which means most of the containers are also, and most of the safety stock inventory is in the wrong place. That means you're going to have a material bullwhip. You're going to have a series of bullwhips, those cycles, until you get them squared away. But now you're going to have a transportation bullwhip as well. And that's why we've never seen this before. All I can do is speculate on how this is going to work out. What I do know is that your supply chain people, and particularly those people in your S&OP organization, are going to be working double shifts to know where material is at, when's it coming, when's it going to be loaded, and the accuracy of data is going to be important because you're not going to be allowed to make decisions based on old or outdated or poor information. You can just have a lot of messed up suppliers, and you're going to have talent mobilizing now. So every one of your employees sitting at home, perhaps yourselves, not only are you doing your work at home, but you're scared to death your company is going to change its business model and you're going to become obsolete. And we know this because the LinkedIn traffic has gone sky high. There's been more profiles put on LinkedIn in the last 8 weeks than in the previous 3 years. And so talent's going to mobilize, means it might go somewhere else. So you're going to have to find a way to protect that talent and also to deal with the distressed people. Like I said, your best solution for dealing with the tight credit markets to come, they are going to come, it is going to happen, is to make sure that you treat capital like it's a precious gemstone, and also borrow up your line of credit if you haven't already done that. And by the way, banks are probably not going to allow that much longer. They're going to cut back on that pretty soon. And we know that because there's extra scrutiny on banks now to maintain their loan loss reserves. And then you have to assume, the other big issue, you have to assume that there's going to be all kinds of problems with dealing with Asia, and particularly China. There's going to be retaliation problems. There's going to be tariffs issues. There's going to be quality issues. We've already seen that on some of the medical devices. So we have to really pay attention to that. And we have to realign all of our internal continuous improvement, all those green belt, black belt projects. We got to go through and decide probably 80% of them have to be shoved off into future years. And so we're going to have to really, really rethink those, because again, it's not about long-term planning. Long-term strategic planning right now goes out maybe 6 months to 12 months. Because we don't know what world we're going to go in. When the rabbit comes out of Alice in Wonderland's rabbit hole, we do not know what the world is going to look like. We all have a lot of ideas, but I don't know about you, but when I have 13 people giving me 13 views of the future, my job is to make sure that I have the most agility of any of my competitors. And that agility comes first and foremost from an enormous amount of capital in the bank. He with the capital is going to likely win. Finally, as we wrap this up, be disciplined about communication to your customers, suppliers, employees, lenders, shareholders as well, and community. Make sure your leadership team is communicating with them on a regular basis. And I want you to remember this. Before I tell you the punchline, I want to tell you a very quick story. In January of 2009, Captain Sully Sullenberger landed an airplane in the middle of the Hudson River. It had 155 human beings on board, including him, and he landed that Airbus A320 on the river. He was a great pilot, still a great pilot. I don't fly, but I have lots of friends who fly. And here's what every great pilot has told me. In times of trouble in the cockpit, there's 3 rules. Never stop aviating, navigate, and communicate. So your first priority is to keep flying the plane, aviate. Second priority is navigate, figure out where you're going to go if you've got a problem, an engine out, loss of pressure, whatever the problem is. And third, make sure you communicate. But in times of crisis, you kick those out in reverse order. So even Sully Sullenberger at some point in time stopped communicating with the air traffic control. That plane, as you see it in that picture with those people on the wings, air traffic control was still calling out directions to Teterboro Airport. But 18 minutes, we have all the stimulations on this. We use it in an SNLP class, by the way. 18 minutes before that plane was sitting in that condition, he made a decision to stop talking and stop listening to the tower. He didn't tell people in the back of the plane to brace because he knew it doesn't really make any difference. He stopped communicating. He also stopped trying to figure out whether he could go back to LaGuardia or go to Teterboro or land on a highway. Once he figured out that Hudson was the best solution, he stopped navigating, and everything was about aviating. One of the problems that pilots get into, and the FAA rule books are full of this. The FAA accident investigations are full of these. I've seen them. It's the pilot got so engrossed and so involved in solving the problems, the safety manuals, the guides, the gauges, the dials, paying so much attention, they accidentally flew the plane into the mountain or drilled it into the ground. Never, never, never stop flying the plane. And yours is, even though we're going through this terrible pandemic caused problem, you can never stop running your business. You cannot forget, you every day have to come to work. You have to know how much inventory you have, where your shortages are, where your people are at. You have to run the business every single day while you have those task teams doing the things I talked about. So here's my final thoughts. There's no rule book here. You got to use your own head on this, but just pull up some leadership principles. Everyone holds a piece to the puzzle. That's why you need some people on those task teams. Prioritize the essentials, delay the non-essentials. That's so important for you to do. Everything you can put off that consumes capital, put it off. Everyone must set aside biases. By the way, back to that delay non-essentials. You may have to violate order quantities and buy less, even if you pay more. You may have to make some decisions that you're not going to focus purely on long-term economics on your supply side. You may have to use letters of credit instead of other payment instruments. You may have to do some things. That's what I mean by prioritize the essentials. You can't build a car if you don't have tires. You have to get the tires, and you may only need 400 tires this week. You don't need an order for 14,000 of them. You may have to make those tough decisions and spend incrementally more to give you lower risk. Everyone has to set aside all their biases, communicate, anticipate what your colleagues are going to do, communicate with them a lot, back up your colleagues. My friends, this is not a time to be pointing fingers. The great Oliver White consultant used to give this speech, and he used to talk about, I go into companies and the coat of arms looks like this. It's his fault, it's his fault, it's his, and we can't be doing that in time of a potential crisis. This is time for everyone and every function to be fully engaged. Tough decisions will have to be made and communicated with clarity, firmness, but also with compassion, because we're going to have people who are going to get hurt out of this. Probably nowhere in our careers have we been faced with such a societal calamity as this imposed lockdown of commerce has created. Trust your education, trust your certification, trust your colleagues at APICS. Pick up the phone. You've got 60 or 70, some of you on here. Pick the phone up to any one of those 70s and say, I have an idea. I need another set of eyes and ears on it. Trust your education. Trust your colleagues. Be skeptical of all data feeding your decisions, though. Be skeptical of it. most of all, stop looking for perfect solutions. Be willing to recognize a bad decision you made, apologize, make a new one, and move on. And so I want to leave you with this last final reminder. We, the human beings, are hunters. We are not prey. Go back to your human roots. Adopt a hunter's mindset and look for opportunities out of all of this. Look for opportunities. It's not just the roofer looking for new business as a result of the hurricane. It's looking for how to get market share and how to then be efficient and how to do a roof in half the time. Look for all kinds of opportunities. You are not prey. You're a hunter. Supply chain teaches us to hunt for suppliers. It teaches us to hunt for demand. It doesn't teach us to sit around and let things happen to us. Be the hunter. And with that, I am done, and I will take any questions that we want to talk about. So anybody want to help us out here with the questions?
I'm going to go on ahead and unmute all calls. So right now, everybody has been unmuted, and please feel free to ask any questions.
Well, Alan, this is Joe Grigg. I have one. So the credit freeze is already starting to happen, as you say. No more super loans for the houses you talked about in California. Do you still anticipate July as being the next the manufacturing credit freeze?
Yeah, right now that seems to be the consensus around most organizations. That seems to be the banks are thinking July is probably where they're going to. Throw on headsets. It's just easier to hear y'all.
Alan?
Yes.
There you go, Alan.
This is Roger. Do you see any particular supply chains that you think will be more of a problem than others upon the restart, other than the Asia comments you made?
So we're seeing food supply, food elements, so ingredients, powders, almost anything in the food industry that is produced by powder. We're already seeing enormous shortages of those. Eggs, we're going to see, we're already underway with a big egg shortage in North America. By the way, the Americas, really, Canada, US, and Mexico. Steel is another one. So we have a huge disruption in South Korea and Japan, and that's where most of the steel, the good steel, comes from. No real disruption in Chinese steel, but the North Korea and Japan, and in particularly some of the other alloys like titanium, we're seeing already starting to see signs of shortages of those. You know, China is just a mixed bag. I don't even know what to say about China, because there could be a glut of certain components and then a tariff or a restriction that forbids. We just don't know. So you got to stay on top of that literally every day and get the tariff alerts every day and get the Chinese supplies every day. The bigger problem right now for the next 10 weeks with China, the biggest problem is transportation. So if you think off the coast of California, we have about 200 container ships sitting off the coast waiting, well, container and bulk ships, mostly container, sitting there waiting to offload. All the crews were sent back to their countries. So we have to, there's like, of those 200, there's about 85 of them that are Chinese flagged carriers. That means we have to get people from China, fly them into the US, get them on a boat, take them, pilot boat, take them out there. And nobody actually knows how to do that right now with the current rules and restrictions. So and then they have to get, there's a certain priority to ships to offload. So that's going to be a real issue. Port of LA, and then the port up in Vancouver, and now the port in Ensenada, Mexico, are just working double and triple time to do what they can now, but it's just not enough. So transportation is going to be clearly a big one. Spare parts. So talked to an executive at Daimler 2 weeks ago, and he already sees a problem with spare parts. And interestingly enough, most of those are from Eastern Europe, not from Asia. They're mostly Eastern Europe. So, and again, the problem is transportation and logistics, and they can't run trucks and things like that. So to the extent the logisticians can solve the transportation bullwhip, that problem can get better much faster, or it can drag on into the fourth quarter. It'll likely go through the entire third quarter. So that's going to create just an enormous set of bullwhips in numbers of commodities.
Okay,
Sure.
great.
Thank you.
Annette, did you have a question? Let's see here. Jerry McQuee's asking, can you comment more on the conserve cash versus paying suppliers? We got the mandate from our board to conserve cash, which is translated to not paying suppliers. Any ideas?
Yeah, the board is wrong on that one. Sorry to say it so boldly, but look, what you have to do is go through and stratify your suppliers. We always have some suppliers we cannot just live without. They're more partners than suppliers, and we need to protect them. And so, if you kind of the halfway is to again go back to making it about not about price, but making it about terms and conditions. So one way to preserve capital is to change it from the amount of capital to the timing of the capital. In other words, say, I'll pay you in 24 hours if you'll let me pay you 3% less. Otherwise, you're 60 days. And so you say, well, but I got to pay for it right away. Yeah, but you took a 3% discount. And if you do that on an annualized basis, that's an enormous economic benefit. So that's the way to get around that argument, is not to make it just about price. Try to focus on terms and conditions. At the nutraceutical company I sit on the board, we have a number of suppliers. By the way, some of them are Asian suppliers too. That it's kind of the don't mess with this list of suppliers checklist, and we treat them exceedingly well. And we have offered them some terms, and we have wired money the day of shipments, and that has given us first look treatment from them, particularly on items that are on allocation. And so if you have any commodity or anything you're buying, you have a supplier and you think that what that supplier produces is going to be used by a lot of other companies, you want to be the #1 company in the allocation list when the dam breaks. So take care of those suppliers. Tell your board you got a price discount, but you had to do it by fast pay. So
let's take one more question. Anybody else?
The supplier will like that because it helps to solve their liquidity problem. Okay.
I have a question, Joe.
Go for it, Tony.
Alan, a lot of the experts, health experts, have predicted a second wave in the fall. What are the biggest set of vulnerabilities when the second wave happens that we really need to be thinking about now as part of that worst case scenario planning?
I completely agree with you. So I don't know that there's going to be a second wave any more than you do. The experts, and there's plenty of experts on both sides of that. So again, we're faced with competing experts. But again, remember I started off with you have to presume the worst case. And what that means is that you have to have a scenario for how you deal with that worst case. And the reason you think that way is because if you think you actually take the position there's likely to be a second wave, that means you have to prepare and get your supply in order before that wave hits. And that means you've got to deal with the transportation shortage or misalignment. You have to deal with the demand. So you may be buying supply and get your company to understand we may have to drive inventory up a little bit on some items to protect ourselves. Again, I will tell you this, I have 40 years of experience. Generally, there's never a shortage of a commodity. There's just a shortage of capital to pay the price to get it. And so occasionally that's not true, but mostly that is true. So even if there's a shortage and you're willing to pay more later to get it, that's a strategy if you have lots of capital. If you don't have a known inbound capital stream, you may want to rethink that. But yeah, scenario planning is everything right now. In fact, it's so great that you asked that question, because I have a colleague of mine who said it's not S&OP anymore. It is scenario planning now. Our S&OP office should be having a whole series of scenarios. Look, forecasting and master scheduling are fundamentally simulation techniques anyways. So we ought to be cranking those on, with drops in certain models, increases in other models, and we ought to see what happens. So I'll give you a really great example. So in the dietary supplement company, we make a product that boosts immune systems, scientifically tested, proved. There's been all kinds of scientific studies, double-blind studies. So this is not hype. This is for real. It's a product that actually helps to boost immune systems, and you would think that would take off, but it hasn't. It hasn't, and no matter how much marketing we put into it. And here's the reason why. The people have to make a decision on dietary supplements versus bread and milk. They have to make, there's only so much disposable income now, and for a huge amount for 25 or 30% of the population, their disposable income is now negotiable every day. And so they just don't know. And so they would consider a vitamin or a nutritional supplement as maybe something that they shouldn't be using their income on. So guess what? An immune boost product isn't selling because it's competing with a basic survival product.
Well, thanks, Alan.
Here's one you're going to really enjoy, though. There's one product line that we've identified that is doing extremely well. It hasn't been hurt by coronavirus at all, and that is skin cream, skincare for women. Skincare for women has actually grown in sales in the last 3 months across North America. And one economist said to me that looks at these micro trends, he said, some people will miss a house payment before they'll give up their skincare. And across the board, the skincare companies are doing just fine. The trouble is they can't get the labor to make it, but they're doing just fine otherwise. That's why I say the rule book runs out. What should be intuitive isn't intuitive anymore.
All right. Well, thank you, Alan. Really, really appreciate it. Hopefully, we need to wrap things up. It's time for us to look to our drawing. Alan, I can't tell you much. I would be shaking your hand and giving you a bottle of wine for being here. Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it all. So we'll move on to the wrapping up this evening. Before I get to the drawing that everybody wants me to get to, I just posted, I need everybody to go to their chat and look at the link I just posted. That is the survey, like I always ask you guys to fill out at our dinner meetings. Please go to that now. I'll send it out via email with Alan's slides and an article right after this meeting, but I need this survey taken by noon tomorrow, please. I'm going to shut it down at noon tomorrow. So please, guys, let me know how we did. There's just a few questions about the meeting here, but your feedback is very, very important. Please let me know. Okay, on to our drawing. As those you may know, this is a progressive drawing, and you must be present. You must be a member of our chapter and present to win. And let's get this going on. So right now we are up to $200. And here we go. Drum roll, everybody on your desks. Here we go. Jonathan Wang. I do not see Jonathan Wang attending. Sorry, Jonathan. Folks, that concludes our presentation tonight. Once again, Alan, thank you so much for doing this. Everybody stay safe, wash your hands, and let's all go back out and get after our jobs. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. That concludes the meeting. If you have any other questions, please feel free to email anybody on the board. And if not, as Joe said, stay safe.